I think what we see is just that, the biggest barrier to doing school differently is our deeply, deeply embedded models of what school should look like in our own brains. A lot of people think it's resources or time or something like that, staffing, right? But it's really mindset.
Welcome to the Education Matters podcast. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Today's guest has spent his career studying the best schools in the world. And he'll be the first to tell you, great classrooms don't start with curriculum, they start with a mindset shift. As a professor of educational leadership at the University of Colorado, Denver, Scott McLeod has worked with hundreds of school districts across the U.S. and internationally. He's not just a theorist, he's a former middle school teacher and trusted voice for school leaders trying to do education differently. He is also the founding director of CASTLE, the only university center in the United States focused on the intersection of school leadership, technology, and innovation. And if you've ever seen the viral video series, Did You Know? Shift Happens? You've already encountered his work and his thinking. In today's conversation, we explore what deeper learning really looks like, not just as a buzzword, but in practice. Scott draws on his visits to over 100 deeper learning schools to describe classrooms where students aren't just engaged, they're actually empowered, where inquiry, relevance, and student voice drive the day, and where kids feel like they matter, not someday, but in the here and now. We also talk about the mindsets that allow these schools to flourish, the principals who create the conditions for trust and transformation, and what it really takes to shift a system that wasn't built for deeper learning in the first place. And finally, we take a look at Scott's evolving relationship with education technology, from his early work in data analytics to his current advocacy for tech that liberates rather than controls. This is a conversation about leadership, mindset, and the human side of change. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Scott McLeod. Dr. Scott McLeod, welcome to the podcast. Where does this podcast find you?
I am currently in Lafayette, Colorado, in the United States, which is about half an hour or so north of Denver and about 15 minutes east of Boulder.
Oh, very cool. I, over the weekend, was just straight north of you, I guess pretty much straight shot in Alberta, Canada.
Love it. I've never been up there. I got to get my family up there sometime. Check it out.
Yeah, I think you'd find it very familiar, but it's a beautiful place up there in Banff. Scott, at this point, I would have given you a proper introduction, but can you give the audience an update as to what you've been up to lately?
Oh, lots of things. My day job is that I am a professor of school leadership at the University of Colorado, Denver campus, not the main Boulder campus. And in that capacity, I run a couple of principal licensure cohorts if educators want to get their principal license. I have about 15 to 20 doctoral students, depending on the semester and how fast we can get them graduated. So I'm doing all that. And that's kind of the day-to-day work. I'm also the founding director of a university center called CASTLE, not CASEL, the social emotional learning CASTLE that most people know. My castle, spelled like the medieval castle, has been around since the mid-2000s, and we're the only university center in America that's really focused on leadership and innovation, deeper learning and technology, all of the fun stuff, as I like to say. And it's through CASTLE that I get to work with schools and other organizations all across the world. So that's kind of what I do in a nutshell.
That's awesome, and we're going to dive into all of that. Particularly leadership work across, as I understand it, across the U.S., but also globally. You've had a lot of exposure. I'm very, very interested in that, and I think my audience would be as well. But let's start with diving into, who is Scott McLeod? Where and when did you grow up?
I'm a Virginia kid, so grew up in the Northern Virginia suburbs, just south of Washington, D.C., on the east coast of the U.S., spent most of my childhood in Virginia, except for a few random months in Austin, Texas. And then did undergrad and master's at the College of William and Mary, and then went off to be a 8th grade social studies teacher. So I don't know if you want me to pause there or keep going.
Yeah. I'll help dive into this a little bit more. So, in Virginia, when you were growing up, how did you play as a child?
So lots of free play in the neighborhood. I'm old enough that we had a lot of unstructured time, which meant that, particularly as we started reaching upper elementary, middle school age, we could hop on our bikes and disappear all day. And that was considered normal. So, would just disappear for hours at a time with my buddies and just, roam around wherever. So, playtime was less structured and scheduled and monitored and all that, which is probably a good thing. Other than that, did a little bit of sports, baseball, soccer. I was never very good at athletics. I've always been a voracious reader. And so continue that to this day. And somewhere sort of, again, like late middle school, high school, really latched onto science fiction fantasy. And that has sort of been my main genre ever since, other than the professional books I read.
So I didn't realize we have another big passion in common. We, for the audience, we actually met through an educator baseball group of all things. But now we're going to have to talk some sci-fi as well.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah. So when it comes to learning, what do you remember to be your first love?
I don't know if I really thought much about my learning as a kid. I think I always remember being good at school and was a decent rule follower, and, so fairly compliant. I mostly remember being bored out of my mind. And I think that has really stuck with me, and we'll probably unpack that over our block of time today. But I mostly just remember sort of sitting around, once I kind of got through elementary school, when you're not, really cognizant of what's happening around you that much, really just started thinking about, like, why am I doing this? What meaning can I attribute to this experience, if any? And, to the extent that I had good learning experiences that really resonated, they were usually hands-on and active. We might have gone out in the community to do something cool, to make sort of like those real life connections. Mostly I remember just sitting and listening.
But what about even your informal learning?
Informal learning.
What do you remember just loving and wanting more of?
Reading. I mean, I was just a reader. So I just read and read and read. Some of that was due to family circumstances where I was trying to sort of like retreat into my room and find a little safe space there. And, reading was a place where I could still exercise my mind in that space. The other thing that I fell in love with was baseball cards, right? And would just completely unpack stats and stories about baseball players and numbers and rankings and, box scores and all that kind of stuff. I kind of remember that also being a love of mine from a, pretty early age.
Well, we share that for sure. And I was just telling my son the other day, because he just had his birthday, and he got a box of cards, baseball cards, for his birthday. And, he was flipping through them and, like, looking for the Shoheis and those kind of players.
Right.
But I was saying, like, take your time to look at the back. And I'm like, they have all kinds of stats. He's like, well, I had that on the internet. I'm like, but I didn't. And he couldn't understand, like, how. I'm like, this is how we would see their historical stats, right? Or sure. I love when they had a little write-up about the players, something pretty unique that not many other folks would know.
Yeah, and they would always have some great quip like, so-and-so caught a bird in their hat. Like, all right.
Like one day in 1973,
right,
he hit the only home run ball to, hit a certain row or something cool like that too.
Right.
I love that. So you are like a good, I want to say 70s kid. You're out and about and
Sure.
riding your bike and reading and doing all that kind of stuff. What did you then start studying at some point, either in high school or later, that most impacted how you think and work today?
So I went into college thinking I was going to be a pediatrician. I really wanted to help kids. And somewhere along the way, just decided that wasn't quite the right path for me and switched gears completely to being a history major and getting my social studies teacher license. So that was a fairly abrupt turn, and you know how those things go in college sometimes. And I kind of remember mostly sort of latching onto this idea that if I wasn't going to serve children as a pediatrician, I could serve them as an educator, but I didn't really want to teach science. I wanted to teach something that I thought was more interesting to teach than science. Apologies to all your science teachers. And so somehow I thought social studies would be the path for that. And so leaned a lot into history and anthropology and sort of, the social sciences, and kind of headed off that direction. And I remember really also taking a few courses in college that, did what they're supposed to, right? Like they expand your horizon. And I started taking like all the non-Western history that I could. Because, in the US, you get lots of American history and European history, and you get very, very little history of any other place on the planet. And so I started taking Latin American history and African history and East Asian history. And then I started complementing it with some anthropology classes or some sociology classes. And not only did I realize that my world was much bigger than, England and the US and France, but also that there were a lot of really cool things out there in the world to be explored, which I think probably kindled my love of travel these days. Is that, any chance I get, I'm like, can I go see someplace cool? And so that's where I really remember sort of catching on fire was, I started really being interested in some of the stuff that I was reading about. I wanted to explore further. Simultaneously, I'm taking my education classes. I'm starting to get into schools with kids. I realized that I really like being with kids a lot. It's really fun. I don't quite know what I'm doing yet, but I can tell that this is my vibe, right? And so that was all happening sort of undergrad and maybe a little bit of master's program. So.
Did you ever teach at the K-12 level, like formally, like years in the classroom, or that was always a kind of research focus?
No. I did my time as an 8th grade social studies teacher in Charlotte, North Carolina, teaching U.S. and North Carolina history. So
you went and did the doctorate later after teaching.
Yes. My wife was a middle school counselor. I was a middle school teacher. And after a few years, we had always known that we wanted to go back and get our terminal degrees. I also had fallen in love with my school law course as part of my master's program. And so when we decided just to go back sooner rather than later before we had kids. It was just going to be easier for us to do that. So we ended up at the University of Iowa. We didn't know anything about the Midwest as, East Coast kids. And just fell in love with the Midwest. We're like, this is the best kept secret on the East Coast, because everybody on the East Coast is snobby. Like, you're going where? Iowa? Is that even a place? Right? Picked up the law degree, picked up the PhD in school leadership. Betsy got her doctorate in counseling and human development. And, we just spent some good times in Iowa. So.
Awesome. So either as your time as an educator or as a role as an professor, what are some of the most inspiring things you've seen as an educator?
I always get lit up when I see kids fired up, right? And I don't mean just like they're having fun in class. I mean, like they're doing really interesting, cool work that's worth bragging about to others, right? And I think that's different from like, we're just having fun in the class, right? Because they might be having fun, but then that might actually be sort of like meaningful work. They might just be having a great time, which is, nothing wrong with that. So I tend to lean really hard into sort of inquiry and project-based learning schools, places that are really heavy on experiential learning, places that, give kids lots of agency and choice and ownership. There's usually technology being used in some interesting way. They're usually tackling real-world problems. I mean, whenever I see that kind of stuff going on, I'm like, we need more of that, right? I didn't facilitate very much of that at all as an educator myself. I was still very old school trained in really took me a long time to sort of wrap my head around the possibilities that are inherent in what's now being called deeper learning. Yeah, I mean, I think just seeing kids going out as difference makers and impact makers, and, really excited to tell you about the work that they're doing is really sort of, what lights me up as well.
So what do those classrooms look like, sound like, feel like?
I think sort of three main things that we see in most deeper learning spaces. One is really high levels of agency, voice, and choice, right? So lots of ownership about what we're learning, how, with whom, what we're working on, all that kind of stuff, which means that they're incredibly motivating and engaging because kids have lots to say. They're not just passive recipients of whatever we're shoving at them. Second thing is that they're usually fairly cognitively complex spaces because kids are leaning pretty hard, not just into factual recall and procedural regurgitation, but also into those upper level critical thinking and problem solving skills that, we're increasingly realizing that we need more of. And not just academic thinking and problem solving, which is how we sometimes define it, but real world thinking and problem solving, right? Because they're tackling real world things. And I think that's the third lens that I see most often is kids are out in the community doing stuff. They're partnering with others. They're making positive impacts on, the world around them. So local communities, online communities, global communities, whatever. And then somewhere in that mix usually is, like I said before, technology is usually in there as an enabling agent, right? Like it's not tech for tech's sake, but it's there to support those first three things of student agency, cognitively complex work, and real world work or authenticity.
And Scott, remind me, the travels you've done or that we've discussed previously when it comes to visiting classrooms, I imagine you're seeking out these classrooms that have this kind of deeper learning in place. Is that accurate?
Yes, I've been in over close to, if not over 100 deeper learning schools now. Yep.
And across continents as well?
Mostly the U.S., but sometimes a few other places. Yep.
What are some of the common aspects as to how that work is happening? Like why is it happening in those places?
Sure. So deeper learning is coming from a number of different places. I think, we saw a push in Canada, right, as some of the provinces changed their sort of like provincial policies and sort of future ready orientations and goals, right? So we saw some of those movements in Canada. In places like New Zealand, they went or Scotland, they sort of had this national push towards what we might call more future ready outcomes or skills or competencies. States are starting to create their own profiles of a graduate that sort of emphasize more 21st century skills or durable outcomes or whatever you want to call them. And then as a result of all that, as the world around us has changed quite drastically over the last few decades, schools are starting to catch up. And so we see networks of schools have started to pop up. So we see networks like the High Tech High network in San Diego, which has got, 15, 17 schools. Big Picture Learning, which is now about 150 schools worldwide. The New Tech Network, which is 100 plus schools. There's EL Education, which has hundreds of schools using their model. I think we just got lots of networks driving this work. And then lots of individual schools that are popping up. Some of those have been around a long time. If you look at sort of the progressive traditions of, say, the New England independent schools, right? Like they've been leaning into some of this for a long time. So I think we sort of see the push coming from both ends. At the top, we see concerns about future readiness and college career readiness and, similar concerns, technological fluency, pushing this deeper learning work down through the upper grades. So lots of high schools kind of leaning into this kind of stuff. Simultaneously, we see the traditions of Montessori, Waldorf, Reggio pushing up from the bottom, and they start to meet somewhere in the middle grades, depending on where we are. But they all have sort of those things in commonality around lots of student agency, trying to get kids to do deeper, more meaningful work, really focusing on relevance and impact making and so on.
Mm.
But I think that's where they're coming from. So, could be, a principal or a school board that's ready to roll. Could be somebody who decides to join a network. Maybe it's being pushed down from a state or provincial level. It's just kind of all over the place.
You do a lot of work with principals. I imagine in these types of schools, the principal plays a pretty unique role compared to the average school. What are those principals like? What are the unique qualities that they need to be really great leaders to facilitate deeper learning?
Thanks for that question, Jason. We actually wrote a whole book on just that. We were trying to unpack sort of what principals in these spaces do differently. That book is called Leadership for Deeper Learning. If anybody's interested, we visited 30 of these deeper learning schools, and we basically interviewed every principal. And then we also said, what are you doing that's different from your counterpart at the traditional school down the street? And they told us, they showed us, we walked hallways, we visited classrooms, we, conversed with teachers and students, and we kind of unpacked all that in the book. I think, we came up with sort of like a miniature profile of a deeper learning leader as part of the book work. But I think mostly what we see is that in deeper learning schools, the principal is using that vision to drive a very transformative and different view of learning and teaching. They're very good at transforming that vision into day-to-day practice. So whatever the school vision is not just some empty poster on the wall that people ignore. There's incredible amounts of trust in students and teachers, both, to make the educational vision happen. So principals are not micromanaging the day-to-day affairs with pacing guides and scripted curricula and so on. And they're really brave, right? Not just the communication skills that are happening here, because they're trying to help other people understand why this kind of learning is important. But they're also willing to take the hits from all the people who don't understand this model yet, right? And we just heard story after story of principals taking the blows in service of the vision, right? And really just acting as a buffer and a shield against all the outside forces that are trying to pull these schools back towards a more traditional model. So there's just a few key things that we saw.
Yeah. I'm actually really interested in that point. Can you articulate how hard it is to create that sustainable change?
Yes, because what we saw over and over again is that usually it was some kind of visionary leader that got this movement started, right? And one of the things we talked about in the book is that there's a difference between a startup school and a transitioning school. So in other words, you have an opportunity to create a new charter school or a new program or a new school within a school, or, the school district is expanding and they've given you this new building and said, go do something new and different with it. Like that's a startup scenario. And those are nice because you get to hire your people and you're starting without, anything counter to what the vision is, right? You're just trying to build from the ground up. Transitioning environments are much harder because you're trying to persuade, folks and systems who have been doing things a certain way for a really long time to do something differently. And those tend to be harder. But in either space, I think what we see is just that, the biggest barrier to doing school differently is our deeply, deeply embedded models of what school should look like in our own brains.
Oh, man. Thank you. Thank you for articulating this.
Yes.
Because you can do it with research and experience. This has been by and large my experience,
right?
Anecdotally. So on that note, that's the key area. Don't let me put words in your mouth, but if I'm hearing you right, it's one of the key barriers to change. How do we help folks change that mindset?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people think it's resources or time or something like that, staffing, right? But it's really mindset. So, and I think there's two main approaches that I see, and I tend to favor the second one, not the first one. The first model, which we see a lot at conferences and we see a lot from school districts, for example, or maybe even states, depending how pushy they get, is they're like, oh, we got to get moving. And, it's 2025 and the world is changing around us and AI is here and technology is here and everything is irrelevant. You got to change everything you're doing. So let's go, 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 go. And they're like pushing you reluctantly from the back, right? And you're like being shoved. And you're like, I don't want to go, right? Like all the teachers are being shoved. And that tends to be a dominant model in a lot of places, right? It's like we're shoving people reluctantly in directions that they're not really sure they want to go. And that's really hard. The other model, which is the opposite of the push model, is the pull model. And that's sort of the model that I try to use is I try to put really interesting examples of kids and teachers learning together. So much so that they're hopefully compelling enough to pull educators toward them, right? So because I have done a lot of school visits, I have lots of examples that I can share. And I have photos and videos and work artifacts from kids and educators and planning documents, whatever, right? And so I can get in front of a group of educators or a school or district leadership folks or a school board or whatever and say, like, I'm just going to tell you some stories, right? And I put some stories out there and they'll be like, that's kind of cool. No, wait, that was even cooler. Wait, that one was awesome. Like, right. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to spark sort of the cognitive and emotional disconnect between where people sit currently and maybe what they'd like to see happen instead, right? Like I want that English teacher to see 2 or 3 examples of someone who's in her same situation, right? They also teach high school English. They also have high school kids. They also have to teach English language arts 9 through 12. And yet they're doing some things that are pretty different. And when you look at them, you're like, oh, I want to do some of that with my kids, right? Because once we've sort of moved people from, as long as they're satisfied with the status quo, there's no desire to move. But if we can create some dissonance and they're like, I want to do some of this, then we're like, cool. Now you've got some will to move. Then instead of pushing you, right, we'll just pull you toward it, right? And then it's just design and logistics work to get you up there. And I find that tends to work much better because it honors the decision-making of the educators, right, who are doing the frontline work. And they're the ones saying, I want to do more of that with my kids instead of what I'm currently constrained from doing in my current system. And that pull mechanism seems to be much more powerful.
Yeah, and I've seen the impact of that kind of method. First and foremost, one of our friends that we have in common, Dean Sharesky. Yeah. I've seen him inspire people to change time and time again in just wonderful, wonderful ways that Dean does, and I'm sure folks like you and many others do. But I also can't shake this feeling that there's more we can be doing structurally to give teachers, principals permission to experiment and to test and to try these different models. Is there anything you would suggest structurally? Now I know, all the systems are a little bit different, but North America, generally speaking, we have a, pretty structured system of superintendents and directors of instruction and technology and principals, special ed teachers, teachers specializations right down to the classroom. Anything in that kind of structure that you would suggest is really the locus for change?
Yeah. So one of the key principles that we learn in leadership school is that it's an ongoing balance between loose and tight, right? Like, where do we want to be loose as a system or as a leader? Where do we want to be tight as a system or a leader? And I think what we're finding is that over the last few decades, systems have been getting tighter. And as a result, they're expecting leaders to become tighter, which is why we have things like the standards movement, where we're trying to dictate exactly what kids should know. It's why we have, packaged and or scripted curricula, where we're going to give you the resources that if you just march right through it, hopefully guarantee that kids will acquire the things that we want them to know and learn, right? We even have pacing guides. Yeah, you're right. We have pacing guides to keep people on pace, right? But all of those things suck the joy out of teaching, right? Like none of us went into education to push worksheets at kids and read off a script. So, I think what we're finding in these schools that empower young people and teachers in a different way is that they're removing some of those tight structures and instead being tight on outcomes instead of process. And so, I have a lot of principals or district leaders that will say to me, well, I give my teachers permission to be innovative. And take risks. They just don't. Right. And it's because you're not creating any structures that would allow for risk-taking innovation to occur, right? Like you're just giving them permission within a whole bunch of confining structures, right? And every message you send to them about test scores and pacing and, discipline and whatever just continues to work against this rhetoric over here that you want teachers to take risks and be innovative, right? So if we don't create structures of safety and trust for educators and kids to try things, to fail, if we don't loosen them from sort of the tight curriculum and time structures that we have, we're not going to get the sort of innovation that we know any organization needs. It's just going to stay stagnant.
Yeah. And is that, Scott, is it like, are you advocating for something as simple as like, a school leader giving them Pro-D time to co-teach or to try a project-based learning, kind of lesson or series of lessons? Is it like that simple, the kind of thing you're advocating for, or are there more kind of structural implications that need to change either at the state, provincial level, or what have you?
Yeah. All of it, right? So as long as the state or province is emphasizing student acquisition and regurgitation of low-level knowledge at a very high pace, right, where we're stressing coverage, we're never going to get, for example, spaces for innovation and risk and depth, because the expectations from the system are working against those other things, right? At the school level, similarly, anything that we can do to crack open the traditional bell schedule, the traditional curriculum, and so on. So I think what we see in these deeper learning schools, for example, is that they say there's still stuff kids need to know and be able to do, but we're going to whittle that amount down by quite a bit, right? So this whole, power standards or priority standards concept, there's not 87 things you need to learn in algebra. There's probably like 6 to 10 key things that we could go deep on that would actually serve you well. And then, as we start to, in some ways, narrow the curriculum to what those essentials are, that then frees up space for us to go deep and applied and conceptual on those, 8 to 10 things, instead of sprinting through, 93 things, and hoping that people hang on to it. So that's part of it. And again, I think they're being tight on outcomes in the sense that they're saying there are certain things that we want kids to know and be able to do at the end of the year. How you and your kids get there is up to you. And so, one of the best marketing pitches I think I'm hearing from these deeper learning schools right now is that they're going to traditional teachers in traditional schools and they're saying, why did you go into education? What have you always wanted to do with kids but have never been able to do in the regular system? You can do that here. And that is an incredibly powerful hiring pitch.
Yeah. I love that. But that's your point of that cognitive dissonance, right?
Right.
Yeah, I love that.
You want to light kids up and get them on fire about your subject area? You want to go do cool stuff out in the community? You want to have kids being impact makers and difference makers who can't shut up about the work they're doing in your class? Come here. You can do that.
Well, and I love it. Even the primary pitch is, don't you want your teaching to be better, more of what you envisioned it would be like, instead of this kind of monotonous grind?
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
And I've heard numerous teachers in these schools say things like, I was ready to quit. I was going to retire. I somehow found this place. I'm completely rejuvenated. I've got, years ahead of me still. The work that I'm doing with kids feels meaningful again. I love it here. Right. I mean, that's what we want.
So if I can ask you to reflect on all the travels and all these schools you've seen, what are one or two key things that you wish you could have my audience side by side with you in experiencing?
I think everybody should have a chance, if possible, to go visit one of the high-tech high network schools in San Diego. They're one of our most advanced deeper learning networks. And if you look at the work that kids are doing out in the community, and the impacts that they're making, before they even graduate, it's quite astounding. And they have built up such goodwill in the community now that people just come to them with offers, right? Like I was there and I was walking through the original high-tech high school. I was talking to one of the science teachers, and, the person was walking me around like, so what's going on, science teacher? And he's like, well, we just got an offer from like some scientists. They're researching oysters out in the bay, and they want to know if some kids want to attach themselves to this project or whatever. And it was like 4 kids said yes. So we're trying to get that up and running, like, like out of nowhere, right? We're doing oyster research out in San Diego Bay. So, right. Because they know that the school has such a reputation that these kids will be great partners, and it'll be a win all around. So I think that's one thing. I think another thing that I wish people could see with me as I walk around is that these schools tend to be havens for kids who are different. So they tend to be very more emotionally safe and educationally safe spaces than traditional schools for kids of color, neurodiverse children, queer kids, anybody who might just be a little quirky, anybody who fits any of those categories and more, tends to be able to find their space in a different way, right? And, they're wonderfully warm, welcoming, inviting, and caring spaces. And the work is open-ended enough that whatever your needs are, they can just fit you in. And so, story after story of parents coming, like they're desperate to find a place that their kid can be successful, and they find one of these deeper learning schools, and they arrive, but they're waiving the individual education plan, the IEP, the special ed plan, and they're like, my kid has all these accommodations they need, and you need to do this, da, da, da. And the school's like, whoa, hold on. So let's explain our model. We kind of do almost all of that just as regular business, right? Like, you don't need to waive your IEP. Like, why don't you just give us a month, see how your kid's doing? And all that kind of fades away, and you can just see like the attention and the parent deflate, and they're like, wait, this school's going to actually work with my kid, right? Like, I don't have to fight for accommodations in a system that's hostile to them. This is a school that's like, whatever your needs are, we'll figure it out for the most part, right? Like, we're going to do our very best. And learning is not so rigid, which means that whatever pathways you need to go down for your own learning, cool, we'll make that happen. And guess what? There's a whole bunch of other kids just like you floating around here. So go find your peeps.
So I want to dive into a bit about now technology and its role in the classroom. But before I do that, one last question about the deeper learning schools. Now, I haven't been to High Tech High. Of course, I've heard of its reputation for at least a decade now.
Sure.
And I know they've been at that work for much longer than that. But I've seen those kind of schools in Canada. Yeah. And I've seen and talked to teachers and talked to the students and got their reactions. Why now that they've been around for so long? Why is the how do I phrase this? Why aren't more schools copying them? Like, the model's there. We can see how successful, the reputation is there. I mean, I think they made a documentary too on High Tech High, right? Like the info's out there. Why is it so slow to get deeper and further along in the public system?
Right. Because our mindset of what school should look like are deeply, deeply embedded, right? And so if you go to your average person on the street and you're like, hey, I'm going to say a word to you, and I want you to tell me what are the first things that pop in your mind. And you say school, right? And all kinds of things pop up. Teacher at the front of the room, textbooks, tests and quizzes.
Boring.
Boring. Kids are in rows. There's a bell schedule. The bell rings, you get up, you march to the next place, you're bored for another 45. Like, all the things, right? And so just helping people understand that school can be different is huge. I think the other thing that's working against that is that we've been sending policy messages since the 80s that test scores are really, really, really important. And for our high capital families, who are more educated and more affluent, that has become the ticket into the increasingly scarce acceptance at the elite college of choice. So that is all also feeding anxiety. On the other end, particularly post-pandemic, we're worried about achievement gaps and learning loss. And so we got to get kids caught up on low-level learning. And so all of these things reinforce the current model. So even when people visit a deeper learning school, like, that's really cool. There's some really interesting stuff happening there. And I can see that kids are lit up and on fire and engaged. That still doesn't mean that they themselves think that's right for their family and their kid because they bought into this other model and still think that's the path.
Very cool. I appreciate hearing that, and I think the audience will too. The other side of the audience, Scott, are a lot of folks in the ed tech world.
Sure.
And trying to either navigate a startup or are part of bigger and established organizations that have been at this for years. I'd like to talk a little bit about the effective use of tech in the classroom.
Sure.
Because I think that's always the qualifier, is the effective use. But
right.
Maybe it's better if we start proper with a dive into Castle and what you do there and why you founded that, and then we can talk about the effective use in classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2003, so that's a couple decades ago, I was early in my professor career. I was easing away from the school law side of me and into the technology side, and just realized that although there were a number of places that were focused on instructional technology, the dynamic between kids and teachers and tech, there wasn't really anybody, maybe it's a couple, that were even had glimmers around the leadership side and system side of all of this. And so we wrote a big federal grant proposal to the U.S. Department of Education, which got funded and turned out to be a $2.5 million project by the time it was done, to create the first graduate program in the country that would prepare a technology-savvy school leader. Partners in that work were ISTE, COSIN, Microsoft, IBM, the George Lucas Educational Foundation. Like, we had a number of folks supporting on the side.
Guys. Yeah.
We gave that curriculum away to 10 other universities, most of which fizzled out pretty quickly because they didn't have the faculty to sustain it. But that's where Castle came from, right? As we sort of became sort of like this national locus or focal point for the intersection of school technology and leadership, not just instruction. And so I've been sort of living in that space since 2005 when we started Castle. I think the connection between Castle work back then and the deeper learning work I'm doing now is that so much of the early work of myself and Castle with schools was around how to use technology to analyze data, right? There was that huge database decision-making model that kicked in the late, mid 2000s. And how do we use spreadsheets and data warehouses and analytical, tools to slice and dice data. And that was interesting for a while, but I just kept coming back to this point that the learning that we're slicing and dicing is all low-level learning. And I made a conscious decision one summer just to stop doing that work because it was reinforcing a learning model that I didn't want to reinforce. And, like you, I knew, we've known from an early on that technology can be an incredibly empowering and liberating device, right? Not just a data analysis controlling device. And I wanted to lean into liberation and empowerment. And that's where I started moving into these different kind of learning models and using technology to support, different kind of, experiences for kids and so on. So that's sort of like the path that I've traveled over the last 2 decades. But spent a lot of time thinking about leaders and systems and tech and teachers and kids. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that in the deeper learning classrooms you've been to and schools you've been to, technology is there and plays a role, but it's not technology for technology's sake. Can you differentiate the two models for the audience? Sure.
So I used to be a professor at Iowa State University, and we had this moment in the late 2000s where we moved the entire state from 6 one-to-one computing districts to 220 something one-to-one districts in 5 years. It was this massive grassroots movement. It wasn't a top-down movement like they had in Maine or, some kind of provincial or state saying everybody's going to get a device. This was one district at a time deciding to go. And in that rapid escalation from nobody to 2/3 of the state, I would hear stories like the following. Hey, Scott, middle school staff, right? Like, our principal's out of the room for a minute. I just want to tell you a story. All right, cool. What's going on? Our principal has told us that he wants us to use these new laptops 3 times a week with kids next year. Cool. For what? It doesn't matter. Just 3 times a week, right? Like classic tech for tech's sake. Like they were trying to prove return on investment, ROI, to the school board. And so they just wanted them to be doing anything at all with the tech in order to back up the laptop purchase. I mean, that's way down on one end of the continuum, right? It just sort of like no conceptualization about whether the technology is adding any value or meaning whatsoever. Just as long as we're using it, it's good, right? So if we can point to, an interactive whiteboard in every room, then, we've done our job as leaders, which is very different from sort of like the concept that I'm going to steal from Chris Lehman at Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia, which is that technology should be ubiquitous and necessary, but also invisible, right? Like it fades in the background. You need it to do the work. You need to have a device. It's there. You got the tools that you need, but really the emphasis is on the learning, right? And then after that, it follows your learning model. So if you have a low-level learning model, then your technology is there to feed digital worksheets and, electronic document movement and whiteboards where the teacher lectures with a 4,000 board instead of a $150 board, kind of thing, right? Or you have a learning model that favors student empowerment, and all of a sudden you're turning kids loose to be, creative innovators and doing all kinds of cool stuff. And
do you think this sort of cultural moment we're in where kids love creating on social media has an opportunity in the classroom or creates an opportunity in the classroom?
Yes, if our systems are willing to let go of some control and to renegotiate that loose tight balance, right? As long as we're super concerned about sprinting through content as quickly as possible, then we're going to create very few opportunities for kids to be creators and explorers. And if we do, it's going to be at the margins or the periphery. It's going to be in electives. It's going to be in after school clubs, that kind of thing, right? So I think often where you see students using technology in the most innovative and creative ways are, in that graphic design class they have as a 7th period elective, when they're working with their peers on the robotics team after school, that kind of thing, right? But English, math, social studies, science, like the core, right? There's this big wall around it, none shall pass. And so I think the other thing that I'm struck by is that kids will acquire really interesting skills in location A, like the graphic design lab, and never, ever get to use them in location B, social studies class, right? Like we're siloing not just the learning, but also where they get to use those skills. So, you walk into some of these coding classes or design classes or whatever, and you're like, kids are doing amazing stuff, right? And then you're like, do you ever get to use those skills over here? Nope. Right? And you just wonder what's going on in that kid's head as they sort of process that disconnect.
Before I ask you our kind of last set of questions,
Sure.
kind of about your vision for the future of education, and this might bring us there. What sort of opportunities and let's call them threats do you see with AI in the system right now?
Sure. If your so technology usage always follows your learning model. So if your primary learning model is transmission regurgitation, and could be lots of transmitters. Teacher is transmitter, textbook is transmitter, website is transmitter, adaptive learning software is transmitter, guest speaker as transmitter, field trip is transmitter, right? Whatever. Where kids are mainly expected to just absorb whatever gets transmitted to them and then regurgitate it back in some approved way. AI shoots an arrow right through that model. Right?
You're going to get a lot of regurgitated content.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I mean, the machine is actually often a better transmitter than we are because, if you think about sort of, these adaptive learning software systems and AI and, videos and so on. And as a learner, you can pause it, you can rewind it, you can speed it up or slow it down. With a click of the button, you can change the language. It adapts to what you know or don't know. With a click of the button, it can shoot you off in a different direction, based on what you've acquired so far. It's much more sort of individualized and paced than a human teacher can do, in a room of 25 to 40 human beings. So there's lots of advantages to the computer as transmitter. That humans just struggle to differentiate and individualize and personalize, right, on our own. But, of course, what it can't do is that human piece, the human side of things. I just posted a graphic this morning, Jason, you probably haven't seen it yet, which I called the AI vicious circle, which is that we now have occurring these dynamics where the teacher uses the AI to create the student work.
Yeah.
The student then uses AI to complete the work. The teacher then uses AI to grade the work. Right? And what are we doing here? Like, we've taken the human out of every single piece of this dynamic, and then the student dismisses the work due to lack of meaning. And that cycle just keeps feeding itself, right? Everybody's trying to use AI to diminish the aspects of the work that they find unfulfilling. And bottom line is, we're continue to remove the human out of the learning teaching process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm trying to find the name of, there's this wonderful article written by a sci-fi writer, actually. I believe his name is, I'm going to get his first name wrong. I think it's Chiang. He wrote the book that the movie, was it Contact? No, what was the?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And anyway, it's called AI, like something along the lines, and I'll put this in the line notes for the audience. It's a really great article. And it's something along the lines of AI is a blurry JPEG of the internet. And he describes this process. Right. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I'm going to share with you. I think you're going to find it cool. Very fascinating. But that idea is there. So that's the kind of, I was going to say pessimistic, but that's the realistic downside to AI in the classroom. Sure. What do you see as the opportunities? Because I mean, within that, I see the opportunity of like, okay, there's no point in believing in this farce of regurgitation, right? Like that's got to die on the vine. Right. So what do you see as like the key areas that we can innovate around or inspire educators around?
Sure. I think this continued idea of something that sits next to you, that is your individualized tutor, right? Mm-hmm. So, over the course of human history, we have gone from human tutors to books, to encyclopedias, to the internet, to now AI, right? Where it's each step along the way, it becomes easier and easier to find what you want to know more about quickly, mm-hmm. Right? So this idea that whatever you want to know, you can hit. I mean, growing up in the 70s, it was the encyclopedia, right? And whatever books you could corral out of the library. But then with the internet, it was search engines, and now it's AI. And it's this thing sitting next to you. It's traveling around with you on your portable smart device. And you can ask it a question, any question you want. And it has a pretty decent chance of coming back with something useful. And then with AI, you can ask follow-up questions, right? And none of that requires a human, which is good because it might take us a while to find the person who's an expert on Japanese swords. But the AI can start feeding us information immediately, right? And so there's a lot of power there. And so I think this idea of a personalized tutor or personalized learning resource that, just continues to feed you information quickly and instantly on stuff that you care about, and that you can fire questions to, and it'll go deeper. You'll go deeper with your understanding and so on. There's a lot of power there, right? Now it's not there yet. There's still a lot of hallucinations and errors and whatever, but that's sort of like the big golden path for a lot of people, right? Mm-hmm. I think, the other, in theory at least, is that it's going to free us up from some drudgery. Which will allow us to lean into those things that make us more human, right? I can spend less time figuring out formulas in this spreadsheet and more time doing things with my family, or spend more time being creative, or figuring out how I can add value to my company or my organization in a different way, instead of slogging through, writing up this 4-page summary report or this spreadsheet or whatever, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of the work that I've been doing with some small business nonprofits and some education folks to understand that, my brother and I called the training we do Sad Robot. Mm-hmm. Find what makes you sad and feel like a robot. Yep. And that's what you replace with ChatGPT to alleviate you to do some of the more creative work. So I couldn't agree more. By the way, and my apologies to Ted Chiang and the short story is Story of My Life. Have you read Story of My Life?
Yes, I've had that whole book on my shelf.
Oh, it's wonderful. And it's Arrival, which is one of my favorite sci-fi movies of the last 20 years. Anyway, I just wanted to correct that for the record. I was having a brain cramp. So if I could ask you then, after talking about, the kind of heaven and hell visions of AI.
Sure.
If I asked you to look forward into the future of education, and let's confine ourselves to North America, but say, 50 years out, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What does that look like to you?
I think kids will spend less of their day within the walls of a school or a classroom. If we can wrap our head around childcare issues, right? I think we're seeing more and more, and I'm going to steal a quote from our friend Dean Sharesky, right? Where he says that, every year we have fewer reasons why kids need to come to school to be the primary locus for learning, because we have all these other ways that we can learn stuff, right? And as Dean says, schools will be the last to figure it out. But, this idea that you have to go to a certain place at a certain time with a certain group of people to learn something is increasingly outdated. And so, you can envision this blend of experiences for children where sometimes they're at school, learning with and from others, but sometimes they're at home, sometimes they're out in the community, they're doing things, they're learning things, like whatever, right? The technology is traveling with them all over. I think we're probably going to see more individualized pathways for children than we have now, rather than offering them 1, 2, 3, or 4 pathways through, their childhood and adolescent experience. There's going to be multiple pathways, particularly as we start heading into secondary, where, kids can really lean hard into stuff that they're finding interesting in. They're able to say no to things that they're not, in different ways. And all of those are viewed as valid pathways towards life success, college and career readiness, the military, whatever. I think that, obviously the technology is going to continue to get more powerful and more accurate. And so we're going to have to create some structures that allow for sort of this freedom of learning by children in ways that right now we're trying to be pretty tight on. But, I think the future of learning, teaching, and schooling is probably closer to what we see right now in deeper learning schools than it is in traditional schools. And I think our employers in particular are telling us that, right? They're saying that, low-level knowledge is just, the greens fee today to play. What we really need is, when you looked at Jobs for the Future and, the World Economic Forum and all these sort of global entities that are telling us what skills our graduates and employees need. And they're always up on the higher end of humanistic, analytical, non-machine replicatable stuff, right? Because the machines can do the low-level stuff. And so until we start moving educational models away from the low-level stuff towards the higher, deeper stuff, more human stuff, right? And so I think we're just going to continue to evolve slowly towards something that looks more like a deeper learning schools model and or a dispersed learning model where kids are learning all over the place, and devices are just traveling with them.
Awesome. So if I could make you the all-powerful education czar of the world,
yeah,
for whatever your time frame, what would you do so every classroom would look like these amazing classrooms?
I think I would free us up from the tyranny of time. I think school schedules are pretty rigid. And so down at the elementary, that are we going to have a literacy block and a numeracy block? Yeah, probably still. Are we going to grab some other times in the day where kids can start to be creators and innovators and designers? Hopefully. And then as we start to move up the grades, right? Like, again, just trying to create blocks of time in the day or the week or the month or the year where children can start having these experiences where they get to own their own learning, where they get to go in directions that they want to. They get connected to outside partners and experiences and community needs in ways that show them that they can make a difference right now. They don't have to wait. And that as they're doing that work, they're exercising different parts of their brain than just the ones that recall and regurgitate. And so I think playing around with time is going to be big. Playing around with location is going to be big. I think every kid should have an opportunity to be involved in one or more experiential learning, community embedded projects that they are driving, not the system is driving, where they say, here's something out in the world that bothers me. I want to try and make a dent in that, right? Probably with some others as partners, and figuring out what that work looks like. And I think, the most successful schools that are really engaging kids at secondary right now are giving kids a chance to do exactly that. So instead of trudging through high school, wondering why you're learning all the stuff that you're learning, you're saying, why? I'm gaining the skills to go out and be a difference maker.
Well, it's even
that I care about, right?
But isn't that it's even further than that? It's just not even the gaining the skills; they're doing the difference making.
Right.
Like I love how you articulated that. That's wonderful.
I worked in a school once that had a big sign outside the building for the whole community to see. It was about 40 feet tall. It said, learn today, lead tomorrow. And I was like, what an interesting message to send to your children. You're going to sit in a room for 13 years and learn a bunch of stuff. And maybe, hopefully, somewhere later, you'll get to actually use it to do something. Right. And, for a young person, that amorphous later is a long time away. It's very uncertain. And so, you don't have to learn today, lead tomorrow. You can learn today and lead today. And that's a huge difference maker for kids.
But isn't that a perfect articulation of the education system of the past?
Yeah.
Like when information was sparse, you had to learn today. They don't know anything. Sure. But that's interesting. That's I want to think about that because I think it just gives you a real piercing insight into the old world education model, if I can put it that way.
Right.
Okay, Scott, always the last question. And I'm particularly interested from someone like you who, I don't know about the audience, but you and I have all kinds of interests I'm finding out in common. So what podcast, book, video, movie, music album, all of the above would you recommend to the audience?
Yeah. Right now, I'm going to recommend two books. That's very professory of me, right? One is Jalmeda and Sarah Fine, who were both at Harvard at the time, wrote this wonderful book called In Search of Deeper Learning. And one of the things that they did was they not only defined deeper learning as they saw it, but then they had different chapters where they visited different schools and looked for evidence of deeper learning happening. And it was everything from a PBL school to a real tight curriculum, tight discipline school, a no excuses school, to extracurriculars, to the comprehensive high school. It's a really, really thoughtful and deep book about deeper learning. So it's absolutely excellent. The other book that I've been recommending to people lately, and some districts have been doing book studies on and have gotten a lot of value out of, is a book from Catlin Tucker and Kitty Novak called The Shift to Student Led. And so Catlin comes to that book from a blended learning structures perspective, and Katie comes to that book from a universal design for learning perspective. And what they did is they articulated 10 different shifts within classrooms where teachers can start making the move to have kids leading more than and directing more than teachers. And so it's a nice sort of conversation starter book and a early steps book for educators in traditional schools about some shifts that they could think about and start working on. And it's a very practical book. And so I like that book for people who are starting to think about making these moves, even within traditional systems, and how might we get started on that.
Dr. Scott McLeod, thanks for being on the Education Matters podcast.
Thanks for the invite.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.